All right, well, in Truth 1, we learned that life begins with God, and that we are pursuing Him, and that He is pursuing us, and so everything should be great, right? But as we continue to read the Bible, we discover that there is a problem that is so big that it actually stops us from being able to connect with God, and that problem is what the Bible calls sin. And we learn about sin starting back in Genesis chapter 2. Remember that God had created this beautiful garden in which Adam and Eve could live and enjoy life and enjoy their relationship with God. And He only gave them one rule, and we discover that in verse 16. It says this, "But the Lord God warned him, 'You may freely eat the fruit of every tree in the garden, except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you eat its fruit, you are sure to die.'" So God said, live and enjoy everything there is to have in this garden, except don't eat from this one tree. That's it. That's the only rule. Very simple. And for a while, Adam and Eve obeyed this and everything went great. But eventually, here's what happens in the next chapter, Genesis chapter 3, starting in verse 6. "The woman saw that the tree was beautiful and its fruit looked delicious, and she wanted the wisdom it would give her. So she took some of the fruit and ate it. Then she gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate it too. At that moment, their eyes were opened, and they suddenly felt shame at their nakedness." You see, there was only one rule that God had given them, and yet they broke it. Down in verse 8, we see the result. "When the cool evening breezes were blowing, the man and his wife heard the Lord God walking about in the garden. So they hid from the Lord God among the trees. Then the Lord God called to the man, 'Where are you?'" And that is perhaps the saddest verse in the whole Bible, because it's the first time we start to see the consequences of sin. You see, when humanity first disobeyed God in the garden, what happened was that sin entered the world. And this sin caused them to hide from God. And it makes us do the same thing today. And the reason why is because sin separates us from God. Sin makes that relationship with God that He wants and that we want impossible. And down in verse 23, we see the ultimate consequence of sin. It says this, "So the Lord God banished them from the Garden of Eden, and He sent Adam out to cultivate the ground from which he had been made." You see, God is perfectly holy, and He can't allow any sin whatsoever into His presence. That is why Adam and Eve were cut off from Him, and that is why you and I are also cut off from Him. You see, ever since that first sin, every human has been born with a sinful nature. Sin is our natural condition, and as a result, every human is born separated from God. So while we may want to pursue God, and God is pursuing us, sin stands in the way. It separates us from God. Now, we'll talk more about what sin really means in the next video, but for right now, why don't you pause and discuss these questions.